Burn the church.
Yo, he's a bad un, isn't he?
All those who stand against England deserve to die a traitor's death.
The film is The Patriot, and that's the outrageously villainous British cavalry officer named Tavington. What you may not know is that this character is based on a real-life British officer from the American Revolutionary War, Banastre Tarleton. I can hear the Americans booing already. Much like his on-screen persona, Tarleton stands accused of massacring and burning his way across the American colonies, especially in the South. Numerous dastardly stories are attached to him, as well as titles like The Butcher of the Carolinas or Bloody Ban. But is this reputation deserved? Are the dark legends true? Well, stick with me because today we're going to find out. As usual, the truth is much more interesting than the myths could ever be. The real Tarleton was indeed a controversial figure. He was arrogant, an inveterate gambler and ladies' man, what we might call today a party animal. During the American War of Independence, he was a ferociously aggressive commander. He was also later a politician who campaigned to maintain the slave trade. But he was also brave, loyal to his friends and considered a gentleman, not only by his peers but by a number of his enemies. His larger-than-life personality has continued to attract both admirers and haters almost 200 years after his death. Now, a special thanks are in order today to my good friend Robbie McNiven for researching and co-writing this episode. Unlike me, he's an expert on the American Revolution, and I'll link to his work in the description below. Banastre Tarleton was born in August 1754 just outside Liverpool. His family were moderately wealthy merchants and prominent slave traders. He was educated in law at Oxford. At the age of 19, after his dad died, he inherited £5,000, over £500,000 in today's money, but within a year he'd spent most of it on gambling, drinking and whoring. I like him already. But the young Tarleton yearned for a life of danger and adventure, and when war broke out in Britain's American colonies, he wasted no time purchasing a cornet's commission in the 1st Dragoon Guards. But his regiment wasn't selected for service abroad, and Tarleton volunteered to go to America himself. Once there, he quickly distinguished himself. On the 13th of December 1776, he helped capture a senior general in the Continental Army, Charles Lee. Lee had been fast asleep at a house in Basking Ridge, New Jersey, miles from the nearest British troops. Learning of his presence, a force of British dragoons, including Tarleton, mounted a lightning raid, catching Lee in bed, dressed in his nightgown. Rapid, long-distance strikes like this became a favoured strategy of Tarleton, and were one of the reasons such fear was attached to his name. No matter how far away they thought he was, revolutionary leaders knew they could never quite rest easy in their beds if Tarleton was hunting them down. The capture of General Lee brought Tarleton to the attention of his superiors. In 1778, a new loyalist American regiment named the British Legion was formed through the amalgamation of a number of smaller loyalist units. Clothed in green uniforms, they became one of the most effective American loyalist units of the war. Tarleton was given the rank of lieutenant colonel and placed in command of the British Legion in the field. Legions were unique units used by both sides during the American Revolutionary War. Unlike most regiments, which were entirely composed of either infantry or cavalry, legions combined both into one formation, sometimes with several pieces of light artillery attached as well. The idea was to create a small but self-sufficient body of troops that could operate independently from the main army and move with much greater speed. Such a raiding force suited Tarleton's temperament perfectly. In 1780, he was selected to take part in the expedition to South Carolina. British strategists hoped that a presence in the Carolinas would encourage the loyalists living there to rise up against the revolutionaries who'd seized control in 1775. The campaign started well with the capture of Charleston, but not long after the town fell, Tarleton's legion was dispatched to catch and destroy a Continental Army detachment retreating into North Carolina. Now picture this, the detachment commanded by Colonel Abraham Buford already has a considerable lead, but our hard-drinking, hard-fighting hero Tarleton rides his men hard through the Carolina heat and over poor back roads, covering 105 miles in 54 hours. He's not stopping for anything. Men and horses fall out along the way to exhaustion, but Tarleton not only catches up with Buford near the settlement of Waxhaws on the border with North Carolina, but he charges straight into battle with him almost immediately, pausing only to have his terms of surrender rejected by Buford. Now let's be clear, Tarleton's not a subtle tactician. As soon as it's clear Buford intends to fight, he orders the British Legion to charge. Buford foolishly orders his men not to fire until the cavalry are just 10 yards away, far too close to stop them. At this point, two things happen that lead to accusations of a massacre by Tarleton and his men. Tarleton's horse is shot from under him and he's left trapped under it for precious minutes. At the same time, Buford belatedly tries to surrender and raises a white flag. However, this happens during the chaos of the cavalry's fight with the infantry. Not a good time to try and surrender. The battle is occurring in a woodland and the flanks of Buford's line aren't able to clearly see the centre where the white flag is raised. The flanks therefore continue to fire on and resist the Legion. You can see how this is now a complicated situation. It appeared to Tarleton's men that not only had their beloved leader just been shot down, but that the Continentals were feigning surrender and then continuing to fire, a trick the revolutionaries had used in the past. Because of this, the American loyalists in the British Legion set about the Continentals with vengeance, striking with sabre and bayonet. This unrestrained killing lasted only a few minutes until Tarleton was able to extricate himself from under his horse and regain control of the men. The battle resulted in 113 of the 380 Continentals present being killed and 150 wounded. Yet a total of 147 men were taken prisoner and released on parole. The wounded were also well treated by Tarleton's men. Now, despite this, the damage was done. Lurid stories rapidly spread of the Waxhaws massacre, accounts later embellished upon. A dark legend had been born. I recently spoke to Todd Braystead. He's an expert on American loyalists during the Revolution. Here's what he had to say.
The phrase Tarleton's Quarter refers to killing a wounded, a surrendering soldier in the act of surrendering. That's not exactly what happened at Waxhaws, where this battle was in May of 1780. That phrase I have not seen it during the time of the American Revolution. That's one of these things that often comes around in the 19th century when you look back upon something. And a lot of the great stories of the American Revolution tend to be from the 19th century with little or no fact from the 18th century.
If you're a fan of Banastre Tarleton, why not buy the t-shirt? You can find it over at redcoathistory.myspreadshirt.co.uk, and also if you search for Redcoat History on redbubble.com. And I also wanted to quickly mention my Patreon page. It's a great way to support the show. Costs $5 a month, and in exchange you get early access to all of my videos and podcasts, and it's a great way to keep in touch. Alright, let's get back to the story of Banastre Tarleton.
Tarleton and his British Legion spent the next 18 months campaigning with Cornwallis in the Carolinas and Virginia. As the main British rapid reaction force in the south, it was the Legion's job to hunt down and harry revolutionary forces, a fact that made them the most feared of the Crown troops. The American Revolution was a civil war, loyalist Americans against revolutionaries, and this was most apparent in the South, where a complex web of local loyalties and divisions ensured neighbour fought neighbour with ruthlessness and brutality. And while Tarleton wasn't the butcher later stories made out, he was also not completely innocent. The homesteads and plantations of revolutionaries were often burned, and on occasion prisoners were hung, though these were generally men who had broken their parole, i.e. had formerly been prisoners of war. British forces in the south tended not to take prisoners, but instead released captives if they swore not to take up arms again. It wasn't uncommon for revolutionaries to do so despite their oath to the contrary, meaning that if they were captured a second time they were liable for execution. Tarleton's actions therefore helped fan the flames, often in a literal sense, but it was noticed that he was less brutal than many partisan leaders on either side. He worked to maintain discipline and followed the rules of war, such as when he had men hung for looting or flogged them for committing sexual assault. Even Thomas Jefferson, the author of the Declaration of Independence, favourably noted Tarleton's restraint when he arrived at Jefferson's plantation home, but refused to allow his men to burn or loot. He never actually burned any churches full of civilians, nor did he dig up the corpses of defeated enemies or murder pregnant women, as some tales tell of him. Certainly there were other officers who did more damage to that part of the world. So the British Legion did prove to be a highly effective strike force, but they were too few in number. They couldn't be everywhere they were needed. And while Tarleton won many victories, he also suffered setbacks. He failed to catch infamous partisan Francis Marion, and at the Battle of Blackstock's Farm against the veteran revolutionary leader Colonel Thomas Sumter, his forces suffered heavy losses. During the height of the battle, a young British officer and close friend of Cornwallis was injured. Tarleton rode forward into a blizzard of fire and rescued him, placing the wounded redcoat across his saddle and riding him to safety. At the battle's end, his coat had been holed in 4 places, but he remained untouched. Enemies claimed his survival was due to a pact with the devil, though his luck almost ran out at the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, where he lost 2 fingers. Despite the injury, he continued to lead his cavalry throughout the close-fought battle, according to one account with his sabre in his remaining good hand and his horse's reins in his teeth. British pluck at its best. While the British campaign in the south had started promisingly, it eventually started to unravel. Another loyalist commander, Major Patrick Ferguson, was killed at the Battle of King's Mountain. In an effort to regain the initiative, Tarleton was given command of a number of regiments beside his own legion and ordered by Cornwallis to hunt down and defeat Revolutionary commander Daniel Morgan. Tarleton conducted his usual ferocious pursuit and threw his regiments into action almost as soon as he'd caught up with Morgan's force at a place called Hannah's Cowpens. However, this would be no second Waxhaws. Morgan cleverly deployed his troops in 3 lines and used feigned retreats to draw the British in. Outnumbered and overextended, the British line collapsed after being engaged by Morgan's 3rd line, and most of Tarleton's cavalry refused to charge at the decisive moment. Tarleton rode forward with a few men and clashed with the commander of the Continental Cavalry, William Washington, but the battle was lost. Morgan had won one of the finest tactical victories of the war. Tarleton narrowly escaped. Most of his men weren't so lucky. His force was almost destroyed, and he never again commanded such a large detachment in battle. The Battle of Cowpens had exposed his limitations as a leader. While charismatic and skilled at raiding operations and lightning attacks, he didn't have the tactical abilities necessary to direct and win a large battle. Cowpens was a sharp blow to British efforts in the south. Though Tarleton won later victories such as Torrance's Tavern, it wasn't enough. The British Legion were among the forces that surrendered at Yorktown. Supposedly, Tarleton was the only British officer not to be invited by Washington to visit his HQ, while another source claims he narrowly escaped an assassination attempt by the victorious Americans, though as with so many things relating to him, it appears both of these stories are probably myths. After Yorktown, Tarleton returned to a hero's welcome in England, and sat for his famous portrait by Sir Joshua Reynolds. Following the war, he remained in the army, but also entered politics as a Member of Parliament for Liverpool. Among his most noted activities were his opposition to ending the slave trade. But as always, things are complicated, and he was a man of contradictions. He wasn't a slave owner himself. In fact, he had actively freed slaves during the fighting in the southern colonies, even ones whose masters were fellow loyalists. However, his family's wealth was built on the slave trade, and so was the commerce of the city he represented in Parliament, Liverpool. He became an infamous opponent of abolitionists such as the great William Wilberforce. Outside of politics, he continued his hell-raising, becoming part of the inner circle of King George III's oldest son and his eventual successor. He had a scandalous affair with one of the most beautiful actresses of the age, Mary Robinson, herself the former mistress of Prince George, and he fathered an illegitimate child to another woman. In between parties and politics, Tarleton continued to pursue his military career though. He was promoted to Major General in 1794 and Lieutenant General in 1801. He served briefly in Portugal and during the Napoleonic Wars was, at one time, considered as a replacement to the future Duke of Wellington in the Peninsula. It's probably for the best that the army eventually decided to stick with Wellington. Unfortunately for those who want their villains to meet a grisly fate, Tarleton lived out his last days peacefully, fishing and sketching. He died at home in 1833. Tarleton was certainly a larger-than-life figure, but fascination with him continued long after his death. Throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, American historians, in their quest to paint as dramatic and heroic a version of the Revolutionary War as possible, enhanced or, to be honest, outright invented Tarleton's more brutal activities in America. Even names like Bloody Ban or Bloody Tarleton weren't applied to him by anyone until the 20th century. Every good story needs a great villain, and Tarleton became one of the Revolutionary War's most memorable. Believe it or not, he's even been portrayed on screen by Michael Caine. And despite his dastardly reputation today, he has at least one pub, school and several streets named after him, including one in New York and another in Freetown, Sierra Leone, which has a number of places named after British generals of the American Revolution who secured freedom for thousands of slaves.
So to sum up then, was he, as portrayed as Tavington in The Patriot, a complete psychopathic butcher? Or was he a lot more nuanced and probably more of a hero? I'll leave the final word to my mate, Todd Braisted.
The honour is found in the end, not the means.
Every conceivable bad act you could attribute to anyone is committed by the evil Colonel Tavington. If it wasn't South Carolina, you would picture what you were seeing as occupied France in World War II with SS troops. So For the record, Tarleton never gathered people into churches and burned them. Okay, let's get that straight. Nobody on the British did that. So you look at that and you kind of scratch your head and yeah, it was Roland Emmerich. What can I say? But they'll say, well, it's just a movie, it's entertainment. But yeah, he was not as evil as portrayed. Was he aggressive? Oh yeah. Did he like to win? Yeah. Did he like him? Yeah. So, but those things he's all guilty of, but not evil personified.
So there you go, guys. If you enjoyed the video today, be sure to like, subscribe, leave a comment, and watch the video that's on screen now. YouTube thinks you're going to really enjoy it.